Hey everyone, in today's video we'll be showing you how to get AMD Fluid Motion Frames up and running on your ROG Ally, Lenovo Legion Go, and more. Additionally, we'll be showing you the difference between FSR 3 Frame-Gen, Nvidia DLSS 3 Frame-Gen, and the driver-based Fluid Motion Frames. If all that sounds a little confusing, no need to worry, I will break it down and have the timestamps so you can skip through at your leisure. But before getting into all that, I would like to thank Ugreen for sending me over pretty much all of their Ugreen Nexode Pro line of chargers. Now, if you stick around to the end of the video, I will be hosting a giveaway which will include one of these chargers if you live in North America, or if you're okay with using it with an adapter if you live elsewhere. On top of that, they also sent me the RevoDock 2-in-1 model, which allows you to connect 2 more displays to your device. As is with most of the docks, it also supplies a 100-watt PD charge pass-through, and a plethora of other ports, including SD slots, 3.5mm audio mic combo, 3 USB-A ports, and 1 USB-C port. If you would like to know more about any of their products, please feel free to follow the links below. If you already have these Ugreen products and you're looking for high quality cables, because Ugreen doesn't include cables in the box for some reason with their chargers, I would also suggest you check out the company called MagTame. If you haven't seen my short on them, they are essentially magnetic cords which are super nice for organizational reasons. They support most modern standards and have a variety of options to choose through. Normally, I would like to dive right into how to get this set up and running for the sake of the viewer's time. However, I feel it's important to know exactly what each technology is and how exactly it should be used. Nonetheless, if you don't care or already know, please feel free to skip to this timestamp. And then that will show you how to just install the beta drivers, or if you're watching past January 24th, you'll be able to sideload the official launch version of the drivers to your ROG Ally and Lenovo Legion Go. Otherwise, it should update automatically on proper hardware, assuming the 7840U drivers come the same day. Now regardless, getting into what each technology is, as I'm sure you are aware, there is Nvidia with their DLSS or deep learning super sampling, and all of the DLSS technologies are proprietary to Nvidia GPUs. To be eligible for their resolution scaling technology, you need an RTX class card, and this is because they claim that it's due to the technology relying on their tensor cores. Now, through the use of machine learning, they can upscale images to higher resolutions, with the higher base resolution often resulting in better image output overall. Now, when comparing this to AMD's technology, FSR or Fidelity FX Super Resolution, it can get a bit tricky. FSR 1 was a spatial upscaler that essentially did a quick and dirty upscale of the image, similar to what might be seen through in-game engine upscalers. Although in my experience, FSR 1 generally looked much better at higher resolutions, with the lower resolutions turning into a kind of ghosting, garbled mess. The upside to FSR 1 is it was generally less CPU intensive, especially on handhelds, and it is much easier for devs to implement into their game engines, especially older ones such as World of Warcraft. Now, additionally, FSR 1 can still be invoked on a driver level somewhat through the use of RSR or Radeon Super Resolution. To use it, apply a lower in-game resolution and it will upscale to your desktop's resolution through spatial upscaling. FSR 2, on the other hand, needs to be implemented more intimately with the game engine, needing access to game data, motion vectors, and frame buffer, whereas FSR only needs access to the frame buffer. As a result, FSR 2 is a massive upgrade over FSR 1, with each iteration improving on the past. With FSR 2.2, we are now closer to Nvidia's DLSS kind of quality. However, DLSS is still widely regarded as the better implementation. However, FSR 2 is obviously more widely available. Now, with image scaling out of the way, we can talk more in depth of what frame generation is, as well as what AMD is offering with their Fluid Motion Frames tech. Moving right into frame generation proper, that would be either DLSS 3 or FSR 3 with frame generation. DLSS 3 is the next evolution of DLSS, which also happens to introduce the option for frame generation. This means that DLSS 3 can run on all RTX class cards, as well as the ray reconstruction introduced in DLSS 3.5. However, the frame generation option can only be used on the 40 series GPUs. Now, with AMD's offering, it is similar with the naming scheme in that FSR 3 is the encompassing brand name for the group of technologies. However, AMD is a lot more generous in who can use FSR 3 frame generation and who cannot, same as their super resolution. Their upscaling tech can seemingly be run on just about anything from the modern era, with less performance gains typically felt the older you go. The frame generation tech is only officially available on RTX class GPUs, 2000 series and up, and the RX series of cards, 5000 series and up. However, the recommended minimum is an RDNA 2 class card. With AMD not relying on bespoke technology integrated in their cards like Nvidia, at least not officially, the results of upscaling and frame generation are often worse than. However, you also do not need to be a part of an elite club rubbing shoulder to shoulder with the 4000 series cards. Now that we have some common understanding of the differences between FSR 1, 2, as well as the naming disaster that is DLSS 3 and FSR 3, we'll now talk about AFMF, or AMD Fluid Motion Frames. Fluid Motion Frames at its core is the driving force behind FSR 3 Frame-Gen. However, it is a more rudimentary form of it. Unlike FSR 3 Frame-Gen though, you can enable Fluid Motion Frames on mostly any DirectX 11 or 12 API based game. Now, much like FSR 2 taking advantage of motion vectors and game data, so does FSR 3 Frame-Gen. Both FSR 3 and Fluid Motion Frames also use something called the optical flow algorithm. However, Fluid Motion Frames can only interpolate what is essentially on screen, and FSR 3 will have the added benefit of the game data and being able to make a better fake or interpolated frame between the two traditionally rendered frames. In my experience using Fluid Motion Frames, it is similar to what early versions of DLSS Frame-Gen were like. Heavy image and UI ghosting can be seen, and the reliance on 60 FPS or more is of greater necessity than with DLSS or FSR Frame-Gen. Fluid Motion Frames, in my experience, is best when mated to a consistent FPS and locked frame rate matching your refresh rate. Otherwise, with fluctuating base frame rates, it can often result in a poorly paced image in regards to frame pacing. As an honorable mention, I would like to also talk about lossless scaling briefly. For those of you that don't know, lossless scaling is an application that essentially would properly scale borderless windowed games on portrait displays, allowing the use of FSR 1 upscaling and other technologies. They have recently released their own version of frame generation as well. However, their implementation requires that you lock your frame rate to the half of your refresh rate, and then enable their frame generation. Like other technologies, they recommend a minimum of 60 FPS going into it. 30 to 60 is possible, but not advisable. Generally, I found their implementation easy to use, but it is the worst of all three. It can be run on seemingly anything, however, for a use case on handhelds with smaller screens, even the image ghosting then and artifacting is too strong to be ignored. Although I will keep an eye on this going forward, as it is nice to have some more competition in the space. Using the OG or the best-in-class Nvidia DLSS frame generation results in the cleanest and smoothest gameplay in my experience, to the point that I can comfortably use it in competitive shooters on hardware that supports it. DLSS Frame-Gen did seem to be a little bit more forgiving with a lower base FPS input. However, if you were to play with mouse and keyboard, you would most definitely feel the delay. Using a wireless controller, a little less so, but at that point I would just work to do whatever I could to get at least a base of 60 FPS with any technology. Finally, when comparing FSR 3, it can often result in an excellent experience when given a healthy amount of frames. Otherwise, heavy image ghosting and artifacting will be felt, and the additional delay versus DLSS, when both operating in their prime, was negligible to myself. However, I'm sure there is some sort of additional delay with FSR 3, as it is not hardware based. Now, this process should be super simple, and if you force installed AMD drivers in the past, it is the exact same. However, there is one bug I have come across in the past that I will show you how to fix if you come across it as well. Going right into it, head over to the download page for either the beta or official drivers if it's past January 24th. Download the whole package, not the auto installer. Additionally, you can choose to download display driver uninstaller, or DDU for short, and this will force install and remove all related files to the drivers. I always find it is best to do so before doing something like this, and it's quite simple. You just load up the program, head into settings, go to the very bottom, disable auto updates, then do a clean and do not restart run. Once you're ready, you can run the AMD preview drivers or launch the 78M drivers, and this will result in an error. However, that is to be expected. It will place all of the files we need to force the install. Now, right-click on the Start menu and navigate to or search for Device Manager. Once inside, click on Display Adapters, and if you did not perform a DDU run, it should be listed as AMD Radeon Graphics. Otherwise, it may be listed as Windows Default, something or other if you did perform a DDU. Now, regardless of the name, right-click on the graphics adapter and select Upgrade Drivers. Browse for drivers, then hit Let me pick from the list of drivers on my computer. Select the Have Disk option in the lower right and then navigate to your C drive, AMD, AMD Software Installer, Package, Drivers, Display, WT6A_INF, and then when you're in there, you should see one lowly .inf file. Note, if you've done this process in the past, it may be best to delete the AMD folder before forcing the install to ensure you are installing the correct drivers. Now, once you select that file, you'll be brought out of the file finder, hit OK, then look for AMD Radeon 780M graphics. Once those are installed, it would be best, in my opinion, to restart your system, as typically when doing major driver changes, it is often suggested to do so. When you have installed the drivers, you may or may not have access to the AMD Adrenaline app. This is required to turn on AMD Fluid Motion Frames. In my experience on 7840U based devices, this app would install alongside the drivers with no issues, as is the intended product. However, for the ROG Ally and the Lenovo Legion Go having the Z1 Extreme, they have their own app version. This can result in a conflict not allowing the app to open up. So I have found a way to circumvent that, and it's a super simple process. Same as the driver install, we already know where to go and find it too. This time, manually go into the AMD folder found in your C drive, follow the same path to get to the WTCXA whatever folder, and then click into the folder labeled B399209. This may be different from update to update, however it should follow a similar naming scheme. Once inside, scroll down until you find an application called CCC2_install. This will force install the correct control center application for the 7080M related drivers. Again, it is best to restart the system after this point. As another potential troubleshooting point as well, if you find you are losing control center application or access to Fluid Motion Frames, ensure that you check off the auto update from Windows in Display Driver Uninstaller if you used it. For one final suggestion, but not a requirement, search for graphics in the search menu, clicking on graphics settings, and once inside, click on change the default graphics options at the top and turn on optimizations for windowed games. This setting is a requirement for auto HDR to work, as well as I seem to recall it being a requirement for DLSS frame generation. Either way, it's advertised to reduce latency in windowed games, and it shouldn't hurt anything by turning it on. Additionally, to activate AMD Fluid Motion Frames, the games must be in exclusive full screen mode. Now, capturing footage of Frame-Gen is near impossible, at least in the sense of giving the viewer a good idea of what it is like to play. With traditional game capture showcasing FPS differences, it is immediately noticeable that something is different and typically more pleasing to view, at least when giving a demo of 30 versus 60. YouTube itself caps at 4K 60, my capture card can only capture 1080p 60, and my phone when used to film typically is capturing at 4K 60. Even though the image may look smooth when viewing a game with Frame-Gen on, either in person or digitally, when actually playing the game it may feel god-awful to use. As such, I have captured the gameplay using various methods, firstly through my capture card, and this will show a high quality look of the specific elements I'll be referring to, mainly with image artifacting and ghosting, and secondly I've captured footage with my phone using its normal 4K 60, and finally I've captured a few scenes using my phone's slow motion mode, which captures at 240 FPS to give a better sense of what is going on frame to frame. Displaying a majority of the content will be a monitor that was actually sent over to me for review. It is from a brand called PIXIO. At first when they reached out I wasn't overly familiar with the name, however a quick Google search later quickly refreshed my memory. And if you've watched other bigger tech channels in the space, they have videos regarding these monitors typically starting off with, "You've likely never heard of this brand." Now this monitor that was sent to me is the PX277 Pro. While I'll save my full impressions for the review, I will quickly rhyme off some of its most attractive features. First and foremost, it is a 1440p 16:9 flat panel display, and coming in at 27 inches, it is a perfect size for a nice crisp quad HD image in my opinion. Now you'll have access to either 165Hz using either USB-C DisplayPort connection or DisplayPort proper. If you're using HDMI, you will be limited to a peasantry 144. No matter which cable you use, it will support FreeSync Premium or Adaptive Sync through Nvidia. I was able to get an Nvidia GPU working with it, and although it shouldn't, your experience may vary depending on the card. Without going completely off the deep end into specs, I will say that this monitor also has a built-in KVM switch, which stands for Keyboard Video Mouse. This will allow you to hook up your keyboard and mouse to your monitor, then use it as normal with your main desktop, but when you hook up a device through the USB-C port, which also supplies 65 watts of power, you can switch over to controlling that device instead, eliminating the need for multiple keyboards or swapping the cables over every time. If you're interested in this monitor, I'll leave links for it below. However, if you want a more in-depth review and living with type video, please do wait for the video to come in the near future. This monitor is not perfect, but so far in my limited use case, it has been enjoyable. Shilling aside, this monitor was a lifesaver for switching handhelds to use. Granted, the same could have been achieved through a dock in my case. It was just nice to have an all kind of nice in one solution built right into the sole USB-C cable coming out of the monitor. Showing off some footage, first I want to show lossless scaling, just kind of running. To make the drawbacks easier to see, I'm playing Horizon Chase Turbo, and it's a very simple game graphically speaking. It's good looking, don't get me wrong, but it's no crisis. First, 30 FPS running normally, as you would expect. It's not as smooth looking compared to 60 FPS. We all know that. However, graphically speaking, there's really nothing wrong with the image. Activating lossless scaling Frame-Gen, you should be able to immediately spot the eyesores. Even though you can see it's being fed a steady 30 FPS at 33.3 milliseconds on the right hand side, the image is less than desirable. The displayed for FPS or Frame-Gen FPS is shown on the top left, showing a constant 60. You can see image duplication along the back side of the car when there's any sort of motion applied to it, and when an object is occluded or briefly blocked by another, such as the exhaust drawing over the bumper. Now, this is giving lossless scaling its best chance possible when upscaling from 30 to 60, and yet in play it is definitely not playable, as the image can be stuttery or choppy at times, and it's just not enjoyable at all. Moving to the suggested or more ideal conditions for lossless scaling, we will now show it generating from 60 to 120. Again, it is captured as 60 FPS through the capture card, however you can still see that there is indeed image breakup and distortion, just not near as bad. But still distracting, unfortunately. At the higher frame rates it's not as bad, but still I would personally not use it in its current state. Going to film gameplay, we'll take a look at the technologies and how they operate in their intended environments. Conveniently, the PIXIO monitor does have a built-in frame rate counter, which does appear to catch the generated frames when traditional frame reporting tools don't. The only caveat to this is it has to be in the monitor's VRR range. As such, you will see sometimes the number in the top right giving out wildly varying numbers as it drops in and out of the monitor's adaptive sync range. However, with this, as well as AMD's Nvidia built-in tools and topping it off with RTSS, you'll be able to see how the frame generation tech works a little bit better. When using DLSS Frame-Gen or FSR 3 Frame-Gen, because they are implemented in the game, traditional frame reporting tools will report true numbers, and as such you can't really see the input frame rate, just the output. Now, when using lossless scaling or fluid motion frames, RTSS or similar will not report the output FPS, only the input FPS. You'll still need to use their built-in tools, with AMD's being infinitely more useful than lossless scaling. This can make for an interesting look, at least with AFMF, because we can see more directly the performance hit to the game's base frame rate or what is being fed into it pre-interpolation. Getting away from lossless scaling completely and jumping back into Horizon Chase Turbo, I want to show off fluid motion frames running on the ROG Ally. Now, one slight tip: if you're using the Ally's performance overlay, it will not allow you to enable FMF. Now, what I want to show you specifically here is the performance impact that comes with enabling fluid motion frames at 30 watts. You can see that with it enabled at 1440p, we're producing about 60 real FPS or input FPS. This does result in a nice clean image with playable amounts of input delay. When we disable fluid motion frames, however, you can see that our base FPS turns into mid-60s to almost maxing out the monitor's refresh rate at 1440p. Playing a real 165 versus a driver-based 120 to 140, anyone would pick the real over interpolated any day of the week. I had played around with CPU boost as well as with it being off, and in certain situations it would result in worse output FPS after frame generation. Moving to motion clarity, I have a few examples. Starting off with Cyberpunk, comparing fluid motion frames on and off, we can see that the same performance impact to our input FPS, but when feeding it roughly 40 FPS, we get an output about 80 to 90, which looks okay for the most part, but does suffer from lag. The same visual breakup and artifacting will happen if you know where to look. Now, when looking at it in slow-mo, we can see that as long as it is being fed 60 or more FPS, it results in a generally pleasing image. When lower, it may as well be Chop City, and this is where it's key to highlight the importance again of ensuring that you have a base of 60 FPS before even considering using Frame-Gen, and DLSS 3 and FSR 3 can get away with looser frame rate and frame timing, but at the end of the day, garbage in, garbage out. Keeping with Cyberpunk, although not officially supported with FSR 3 Frame-Gen, however I expect that to change very quickly in the near future, we have mods from the likes of LukeFZ, and using their paid mod we can see that FSR 3 and what it could look like in Cyberpunk in an official fashion. Taking a look at the lower end, giving the game about 40 FPS before Frame-Gen, you can see that it looks and plays as you'd expect. And when enabling FSR 3, we get a boost to about 70 FPS, and without any upscaling enhancements, we get to about 60. Nonetheless, we can see that in motion is generally much more pleasing to look at versus the Fluid Motion Frames generation tech. Now, although the input delay is similar to DLSS Frame-Gen, if not worse so, playing with the keyboard and mouse at the minimum frame rates recommended may not feel the absolute greatest. Playing with a controller may result in a more enjoyable experience in this regard. Now, switching over to Slo-Mo again, although this time on the Lenovo Legion Go to give more context to handheld users and what it may look like for them. Utilizing the LukeFZ mod, we can see how badly the image can break up at the lower FPS range, but as we increase the base FPS, you can see the smoother it gets, and when playing on handheld, the image distortion can be less noticeable at times. Regardless, Frame-Gen is much better when implemented directly into the game, whether done by devs or the community. Finally, for Cyberpunk, very briefly, I will show the Nvidia DLSS 3 based frame generation utilizing a laptop 4080 GPU. You can see that when showing a 70 to 80 native FPS range at 1440p, it results in a smooth image. When enabling the frame gen, even more so, almost doubling the frame rate at times. To give an idea of what DLSS looks like in its worst showing, I turned every settings to the max and achieved about 30-ish FPS with frame generation on. Even still, I would say the image quality is much better than FSR 3 at similar settings and output, but I would absolutely recommend you do not play this way, as you can see in the top right hand corner the total system latency is resulting about 150 milliseconds, which is awful. When I said I expect Cyberpunk to get native FSR Frame-Gen support, that is based on the very recent uptick in developers adding the technology to their games. This week, I believe I saw about 5 or so games getting it added natively, one of which being Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. Thankfully, I don't own Modern Warfare 3, however, we are still able to check the technology out in the free-to-play Warzone environment. Granted, this isn't the best case for showing such technology given the online variables. Nonetheless, I've done my best to show back-to-back footage in certain areas showcasing FSR 3 on and off, when implemented into the game natively. Now, for this game, we'll only be looking at FSR 3, as I would assume enabling Fluid Motion Frames may result in potential banning your account somehow, similar to the Anti-Lag Plus feature back in the day. Now, moving into a typical Warzone gameplay scenario, we can see that on the GPD WinMax 2, we were able to achieve roughly 80 to 120 FPS depending on the scene. This is running at 28 watts on the device, outputting at 1080p. When dropped down to 900p, we were able to stay above the FPS mark more often than not. Again, depending on the scene, and generally gameplay feels pretty good at this state. However, we are still not achieving the suggested 60 FPS input at all times. Dropping all graphics options down below the minimum values beyond the minimum presets results in a more stable experience. However, I would still say personally it is less than ideal. It is not until we drop down to 720p that we are able to comfortably maintain an FPS above 120. Mated with the VRR display, and you'll likely be in for a very good time. Then it is likely that the arena-based portion of the multiplayer of Modern Warfare 3 will generally run better, as was the case in the second game. However, I honestly don't feel like giving Activision another $100, so either way, you may not need to drop the options as low if you only played that section of the game. Showing off some slow-mo shots comparing FSR 3 Frame-Gen on and off, we can see that when using FSR 3 performance without Frame-Gen, at 720p there is generally a good amount of quality retained in the image, keeping in mind that the camera is capturing at 320 frames per second in a 30 FPS container. You can see some mild ghosting shown in the bolt of the gun when firing, as well as the shells being ejected. Now, there is nothing really wrong with the image overall in motion, and at full speed the game does feel excellent to play. Turning Frame-Gen on, we are now maxing out the monitor's refresh rate, and quite honestly, it'd be hard pressed to find much of a difference at this resolution and frame rate. The generated frames fell well within the recommended requirements, and result we are given with a very clean image in motion, with most of the image problems being caused by the resolution upscaling and graphics options. Not to mention, it is blown up onto a monitor. Like I said before though, garbage in, garbage out. Showcasing a different perspective and what more indicative of regular gameplay, here's a longer slice. Wrapping everything up, what are some of the key takeaways? Firstly, as if it wasn't already beaten to death, you must have a minimum of 60 FPS before using any sort of frame generation. For lossless scaling and fluid motion frames, anything under will result in a very bad time. FSR 3 Frame-Gen and Nvidia DLSS 3 Frame-Gen are much more forgiving with the base FPS given, however, the input delay will suffer greatly. When playing around 30 FPS after frame generation, we are left with over 150 milliseconds of delay in Cyberpunk 2077. Secondly, the technology will get better over time, just as DLSS 1 through 3 and its updates to their frame gen improved over time. So will FSR 3 and Fluid Motion Frames, I'm sure. The UI ghosting present in Fluid Motion Frames at times will hopefully be mitigated in the future, and the image quality likely improving as well. FSR 3 will without a doubt get better over time, and it is my educated guess that AMD will soon start utilizing their AI cores and features found in their CPUs and GPUs, if they are not already, to improve its quality further than hardware without. Third, don't knock it till you try it. I've heard from a lot of people who have not used the technology but are dead set against it. So oftentimes latency and impact of gameplay is cited. Latency is a concern with the technology, and if you are in the uber elite of competitive shooters, then yes, I would suggest you turn FrameGen off. However, there is a free-to-play shooter called The Finals that has DLSS FrameGen in it. I have absolutely no issues playing this game and still being able to hold my own. I have never once thought that I got killed due to the technology, and mind you, the FPS was ranging from 120 to 170. The only times I've noticed my gameplay being affected or actively noticing latency was if the FPS given was less than or very close to 60. When playing with the keyboard and mouse, the delay can be felt here. It would be kind of similar to a wireless controller latency delay though. Fourth, don't expect miracles. If the game has no hope in running even remotely well before frame gen, such as Alan Wake 2 on the handhelds, I would not bother. By all means try it, and I'm sure there are people out there who will be able to play it and enjoy the experience. Just think of all the people in your life you've had to tell to use game mode function on their TV when playing games. I want to hear from you and your experience with the technology in any of its forms. With it becoming increasingly popular in games and with FSR 3 FrameGen being added post-launch to others, hopefully it will become more accessible to the community so they can test it out for themselves. If you haven't tried it, I would like to hear from you as well. Do you think this is something that will be here to stay for the foreseeable future, or is it something just temporary? Let me know in the comments, or feel free to join the Handhelds United Discord, link found in the description. Now, getting to the part that most likely are here for, the giveaway. The item or items being given away are an orange and black LTT screwdriver valued about $70 US. Secondly, I'll be giving away one of the Nexode Pro U-Green chargers, or if you'd like one of the 65 watt RoboGAN chargers. These vary from $35 to $120 US. And optionally, if you live outside the US, I'll be giving away one of the U-Green docks, or if you prefer it, over the charger. The giveaway will be worldwide, however the recipient will be responsible for any sort of taxes and duties that may be applicable. Leave a comment below answering these 3 questions in this format. 1. What is your preferred color, red, blue, or green? 2. What game do you wish had frame generation so that you could check it out? And 3. Where you live, do you use the 12 or 24-hour clock format? If the questions are not answered in that order, you will not be eligible. That way, it'll prevent those who don't want to participate from being selected. I'll host the draw on January 28th, giving the video about a week for people to enter. I will use a random comment picker app found in the description, however, I will skip over those that do not answer in the correct format. If you are the winner, I will reply to your comment, and I will not ask you for any money, phone number, WhatsApp, WeChat, Tinder profile, or anything like that. It will come directly from my YouTube account. This giveaway is in celebration of my 5K subscriber mark, and I do hope in the future to do more. Likely it'll be game codes though embedded in the video. Finally, as we head into the new year, I may not be able to make the content as frequently as I'd like. As such, for the YouTube channel members I will be deactivating the ability to subscribe in that fashion. Quite honestly, it feels a little wrong taking money when I'm not producing as much as I would like, and especially when I make no promises or anything if you subscribe. So thank you Darkstar, Rico1217, Root Access, and P3CMKR for the final time. I do appreciate you all, and to all that have become members in the past. Perhaps buy yourself or someone else a small treat with it instead. As always, thanks to everyone who has subscribed, liked, disliked, and have told me I'm an idiot. It is appreciated. I hope you all have a great day.